Brian, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. For people who aren't familiar with you and all the great work you're doing, whether that be at Team Builder or at Elon and beyond that way, would you mind filling in a little bit about who you are and all you got going on?
Absolutely. I am in kind of a dual role here in my career. So I am the director of customer success at Team Builder. But on the side, I also work at Elon University, and essentially there it's another hybrid kind of role. So I am the assistant director of sports performance as well as the sprints and hurdles coach for the track team. Working with the track team in the weight room, the cross country team, the throwers, and then the head assistant for football underneath our director, Nick DeMarco.
That's really awesome. And that's such a unique role to kind of be able to blend the work on the football side of things with the work from a sprinting side of things. And obviously, as we were just talking about, I think there's a little bit of carryover between the two. I mean, so much so that a lot of the high school kids that I've worked with that play football also run track and field in the springtime that way. And that was something that came up for my own kind of, limited football career that way when I was in high school. It's like, a lot of them just ran track as well that way. So I'm interested to kind of hear your thoughts a little bit before we get into kind of acceleration zones and so on that way. What's kind of your thoughts on the track and field carry over to football and this like kind of development model that a lot of, high schools seem to push in relation to football kids also running track and field?
I think at that kind of level, there's a lot more similarities than there are differences. And as you kind of go upwards in the levels, especially when you get to, high level college, even at the FCS or mid major level, and then onwards, P4, and then professional football, that's where it starts to really have that divide. But in the high school level, there's a lot of similarities just being young training age in the athletes and constructing a well-rounded, more robust athlete, right? And that's when you start to think about, pure speed is going to be one of those things that can be a difference maker. It's not a lot of slow guys that make it to high level football and continue to be successful. So a good ran track program is going to influence a lot of really good high school football programs. I believe that in the kind of sports realm, especially when it comes into like more physical preparation, sports performance, whatever you want to call it, etc. One of the biggest things that you're going to see is we're going to steal a lot from track and field. I think that's you start to look at people like Charlie Francis, you start to look at other influences that have come into it, even just like bringing it down to athletes like Ben Johnson, Noah Lyles, Altus has come through with Stu and Dan, where a lot of their background is working with sprinters, but then they're influencing what goes on in the field sports. Guys like Buddy Morris, they're going to steal from that, right? We kind of bring into like high-low models, which over the course of the last couple of years, I'm starting to realize that a high-low isn't necessarily something that's always going to be apparent. So you're going to have to work your way around it. But nonetheless, a speed-based program in the aspect where you're going to emphasize like field work a little bit more than just the general weight room is probably going to lead to a lot more success because it has a higher correlation within dynamic correspondence. Matching the 5 categories and then being able to provide some context in that situation to essentially, if someone can accelerate very, very well, right? Maybe even if it's not top end stuff, obviously top end it is the rising tide that raises all ships. So getting that is very important. But especially a general athlete, if they can accelerate really well, they're probably going to get some initial separation. If it's talking in terms of like football, like a wide receiver, it's also probably going to make a very productive track athlete if you can accelerate efficiently. And that might mean the difference of, taking first at the state championship or taking third because your start wasn't as good. And then the other aspect is that when you go into like the field-based sports, if a receiver can create initial separation and make a move, it's likely that you're going to have less of a contested catch and a higher possibility to just use the necessary requisites to just catch the ball in a little bit more of a favorable position instead of having to battle it and then the play's kind of dead right there because maybe you're both up in the air kind of on top of each other, kind of dangling for the ball. It's more of a catch and run.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And you brought up so many amazing points there. And I kind of want to run them all back. I mean, first off, on the overlap from track and field into organized team sport, whether that be Olympic sport or football or beyond that way, one of the things that continues to come up when I'm talking with strength coaches and clinicians that way is this concept of tissue capacity and tissue resiliency. And one of the things that continues to come up is the fact that we cannot mimic the effects of sprinting in the weight room. whether that's the forces that go through the hamstrings or wherever it is that way. We just have not found a way to capture that same effect in the weight room. So it's like we have to sprint them. Well, if you start sprinting them at a younger age, you get them exposed to some good sprint mechanics, some sprint drills, some things that get them moving at top end speed. You just start building their tissue capacity and robustness from an earlier age. So I think it makes a lot of sense to start that process early on. But on top of that, you mentioned about speed work and acceleration zones. And one of the things that I think can really ruin this process of long-term development from track and field carrying over to football is when coaches decide to turn it into a conditioning session instead of a speed session. With a lot of my lower extremity rehabs, we do sprint work on field as long as we're able to get to that from like a insurance visit standpoint. And when we're doing that, we do really long rest periods, so much so that it's almost boring to sprint because it's like, oh, shoot, we're going to stand around and we're going to kill some time because we got to let that energy system recover. And a lot of the times I see coaches, and maybe this is just my bias, but they almost turn it into conditioning where it's like, hey, we do our sprint, maybe it's 40 yards, and then we take a 15-second rest, and then we do another 40, and then another 15 seconds, and another 40. And they just repeat that process over and over and over again. And regardless of what our adaptation that we're seeking is, whether that's the top end speed side or the acceleration side, I don't think we're getting it if we turn our speed work into conditioning.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Right. The general rule of thumb is about 6 seconds for every 1 yard that's sprinted, or the more common variation of it is a minute for every 10 yards or every 10 meters. I think this is a little bit more towards the practitioner who takes some ownership of the entire session. Um, right. Say you have, 120 yards of acceleration volume on the given day, and you want to do either, 60 yards of 15s, 60 yards of 10s, right? You want to get your rest periods in there. How do you fill that time to make it seem like you're being productive and no one's standing around? I think that's where a lot of people start to question things and they're like, well, maybe I do something that it makes it look like we're doing something. And this is where I'm not necessarily in favor of doing like maybe sprint mechanics. Just because to a certain extent, especially when a coach is watching, some kid is going to gun that rep. And now we've just negated the entirety of the rest. Right. So especially if you think of like hitting some boom booms or even ace skips, they're probably going to go super hard if their coach is on the sideline standing around. Right. That's when you kind of bring in, maybe we bring out extra bands and I'm going to have you just work through ankle mobility in between sets. Right. It's very low intensity. The heart rate can come back down. We get the central nervous system recovery. We're still getting work done, but it's less invasive to the overall arching goal of the session, which is going to be high intensity sprint yardage or high speed volume or just the output itself. And another way to hide that, right? That's the opportunity to coach, give immediate feedback, really make the corrections during that session in those 1 to 2 minute periods of gaps or 3 minutes, whatever it is. You can take that time to address the group. A coach isn't going to probably get, a sport coach probably isn't going to get too upset with you if you're coaching in that time. So using your voice to fill that void and allow those athletes to rest. They're still mentally engaged. They're not off, playing rock, paper, scissors or talking about what they're going to do later because they're paying attention to you. So they're still in tune to the session, but now you've just cushioned that rest time. And that way you can get a higher quality rep. It's less about the total volume when it comes to sprint work than it is about the quality of the volume that you're getting. Whereas in a more, I guess, like aerobic based development, it's more about, hey, we need extensive or intensive contacts to build the robust tissue to then prepare the athlete for whether it be camp or games or et cetera, whatever it might be. But that's when that's when a coach can really take the opportunity to give those cues, fill that time, and then at the same time, now the coach is saying, all right, well, he wants to make sure everything's right. It's a very like detail-oriented coach. I'm just not going to get in the way. I'm going to let him talk because it's the same thing as if they were going to talk, in between a couple of plays to make sure that, they know it's a cover three buzz or if it's a cover three match or a sky call, right? We have the right people in the right positions. No one's going to get in the way of someone coaching. So if you use that opportunity to coach, you've now built in that rest period.
Absolutely. I love that concept of using those rest periods as an opportunity to reflect acutely and give feedback to the athlete. I think one of the things that we often forget about is a lot of times, as you mentioned, we tend to want to coach the athletes all ourselves and tell them what to do and what to do different and what to think about and throw 1,000 different cues their ways. But sometimes I've actually found more value with the sprint with asking them, hey, how did that feel? That feel as good as the last one? What do you think? And kind of putting them on the spot and starting to get them kind of in tune with how their own body feels and moves that way. Because ultimately, we want to get them to a point where they can kind of do this on their own, where it's like, hey, if something doesn't feel right, can you course correct? Or are you always going to be reliant on me giving you a certain cue that way? And then it gets into the whole rabbit hole of which cue works for what athlete and so on that way. Because I mean, obviously there's great work done by some different individuals, like Nick Winkelman comes to mind on the language of coaching that way. But it's like I can get lost in this world of cueing versus if I can find a way for the athlete to come to this self-realization of like, this sprint felt different than the last sprint effort. What could have caused that? Oh, maybe it's this. Maybe I'll try doing this different. Like maybe I felt like I was leaning too far forward on this one compared to the last one, or maybe my chest rose too early, whatever it is that way. And the sooner you get them to realize kind of what they're doing and develop that self-reflection process, I think the better off your entire development from there is going to be, because they're learning how to be in tune with their body instead of learning how to be in tune with that constant external feedback, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's one of my favorite things, like, when you're coaching speed, because you have a lot of time during those rest periods. The very first question that I'll ask my sprinters if we're at practice or if, right now we're in the summer in the midst of, summer football workouts, talking to an athlete that may have just ran a rep, and the first question I'm gonna ask is, "What do you think?" Right? It's very open-ended, it's very broad, right? And even at the very least, if it gets them to start to question things and things facially around the situation, maybe we get an answer that we might not have identified ourselves, right? I think it's a really good opportunity to learn from the athlete as much as they can learn from you, right? It's very easy to want to be the person who has all the answers, who can correct anything and make everybody great, and it's all these different things, right? But when you have an autonomous athlete, especially as they get older and they're a little bit more in tune with what's going on after they've been in your system for 1 to 2 years, you know, when you can ask them, "What do you think?" They're gonna be able to identify, all these past times that you've given corrections or given cues, and they're gonna say, "It just didn't quite feel right. I felt like I was a little bit more backside." Right? It's on us to have the coaching eye to be able to identify, that's where I'm kind of trying to lead you on this path to get you to have a conversation with me about it. But having them intro that conversation and bring that point up to you is probably gonna make them a better athlete, because at the end of the day, they still have to compete, right? They have to go out into a race if they're a track athlete. When, you could be on the sidelines traveling with the team, but are you really gonna make a correction on, form or whatever? I mean, we'll joke about it and have, comments with some of the athletes when they, catch a nice pass and they're opening up their hips. But just like you said, if they can course correct mid rep because they know and they have that little bit of feeling and they want to open up, and they, running back breaks a wide sweep to the right and he's opening up that stride, he kind of knows a little bit more about it. And if he does, he can have that kind of go, right? And if we can make that a subconscious cue by getting repetitive actions over the same course of time along the same movement bandwidth, they don't have to think about it then. Then we get that little bit of like the perfect bell curve of like the anxiety arousal where every athlete that's out there that has a really pinnacle moment or a really great game, they always give the same answer. I don't know, I just kind of blocked out and it happened, right? Well, now we can get that subconscious to take over and it just works because it's an ingrained movement pattern and they're probably just a better mover with higher movement literacy to be able to just let that happen versus them kind of slowing down the thought process in the game, thinking about positions and wanting to go through that themselves. Now it just takes over and they open up and they stride out.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't have said that any better. I mean, it becomes almost like to the point where sprinting is in the flow state, if you will. As you mentioned, it's like just so second nature and so ingrained that they don't have to think about it. And obviously, in a sport like football, that is a game of inches at the end of the day. Did you miss the tackle or were you able to break away? Or as you mentioned in relation to the wideout example, it's like, hey, can you get that early separation? And if you can, hey, you might be significantly more likely to catch that pass that way. So naturally, when it comes to those games of inches, making things second nature just enhances your ability to get that separation and break free early on that way. You mentioned your system as well in relation to that and how athletes will kind of learn the system over time. And because of all the reps that they do, it becomes so ingrained. I'm interested here. What has been kind of your systematic or framework based approach, if you will, for developing speed in the D1 athletes that you work with at Elon that way. Because obviously, you get a wide array of different athletes coming in. You get some that, like we mentioned, have had that track and field background and they've, sprinted 100, 200. They've played football all their life. They're ready to go. And you have some that, they've played football and they're incredibly skilled and gifted, but you watch them sprint and you can't really decipher what you're looking at. It's like, is this kid an athlete? So what's kind of been your approach to kind of developing that on a sprint and speed side?
Yeah, I'll kind of attack this from a more football standpoint when it comes to this, just because it's a little bit more interesting on the way I kind of view it. A football player is a master of being a football player, right? They're a sprint generalist in a sense, where it's mainly there to support the activity of football. So getting them the necessary requisites in order to be more successful at the sport is the number one goal, right? Which is going to make them inherently more biased towards acceleration than it is max V. Again, I love max V. Love being able to get top end speed, seeing 21, 22. We just had a 22-mile-an-hour guy this last Tuesday, which is great to see. But how fast can they accelerate, right? How efficient can they accelerate, and what's that movement pattern? The way our system is kind of set up is that we're going to dial in the 0 step, so essentially the moment of overcoming inertia into the first contact on the ground, and then early acceleration to late acceleration. So most of our system, when we attack a lot of our field work, especially in the summer, we're on the field the hour before that lift. It's more important. It's really dialed in. Even on our aerobic days, every tempo that we run isn't necessarily a very lax, just get the aerobic development. And this is where we kind of have a theory on functional capacity, right? Capacity is the ability to accomplish the task at hand. Whereas like we kind of define a working definition of functional capacity is to accomplish the task at hand while looking biomechanically correct. So we're not necessarily breaking down in the simplest of terms their form, right? Every rep on a tempo, it starts just like every rep on a sprint. We're putting them into a position where their chest is over their knee, the center of mass, the knee is over the toe, the pressure's on the ball, the front foot, and the back foot is anchored, right? Their tempo might be at 70%, but they're taking at least one hard step to get them launched off and overcoming the inertia. So we're getting continuous reps at acceleration mechanics, even on the easy day, and working that into it. We start to think about thigh separation. Thigh separation around 100 degrees is what's going to be optimal in that acceleration mode to make sure that they can continue to get the stride length, and we're not taking essentially 5 steps to go 3 yards. We want to have big, powerful, longer ground contacts, less flight time to essentially build that mechanic to then promote that top speed. Getting them efficient at the acceleration is going to be a big effort. If we look at more so from and I understand I'm hopping around here, so if anyone wants to yell at me, that's okay. But if we look at even our max velocity day, our max velocity day is still centered mainly around acceleration. It's a hard start. We're not just taking rolling starts and running and ripping flies. We're lucky enough to have GPS units on their backs that we can record their top speeds and see that all mapped out. So what we're doing is a sprint and hold. So maybe, we've worked up to a 20-yard sprint into a 20-yard hold, or a 15-yard sprint to a 15-yard hold, right? And that helps us accumulate high-speed volume at around 14.84, 14.86 kind of yards. They're going to get that 90% threshold for that high speed, which is enough to get them the distance and the capacity, or essentially the output, to continue to expand on their max speed. But how does that look getting there, right? We want a functional output. Now I want them to be able to accelerate very efficiently, not be, an anterior pelvic tilt where everything's happening behind them, but more so being able to dig into the ground, have that knee flexion, and have that hip flexion to then piston strike back into the ground and get the necessary ground interaction. All this stuff, if we were to write it down on a whiteboard like I have behind me, it would look like everything in the human body as just bubbles everywhere with lines across as a complex system, all interacting with each other to make sure that it all goes into the same kind of form and the same kind of pathway. Basically, just to kind of bring it back and say that everything we do is going to be centered around making them very efficient movers. And by making them very efficient movers, we naturally start to build the outputs just by adding either some distance, adding some reps, and make that very simplistic from that point of view. On paper, it might look like a very simple program. It's when we get on the floor, we're going to coach it very differently than somebody else. And it's going to be a lot more detail oriented into all this stuff. Even down to the prep that we do, you know, we're rocking multiple variations of different mock drills, A skip, you know, single leg, double leg backwards, just to get them in that kind of striking position. And then we're working through dribbles to accentuate the max velocity stuff. But what we want is that everything is becoming subconscious. Everything is making it very essentially non-thought to make sure that when they get into an action that they have to go perform, it just is an ingrained pattern that then they can catapult into a higher acceleration, a higher top speed, etc.
Absolutely. I love the way you broke that down, Brian. And to me, the way my brain works, I think about things in biomechanical and neurophysiological constructs. And it sounds like the way you approach speed training, and in particular for the acceleration, is more, in my mind, a neurophysiological construct than a biomechanical construct. I think sometimes I talk with coaches that are like, yep, we're going to get them to run faster. We're just going to, optimize their biomechanics, and we're going to give them endless correctives and drills and so on that way. Whereas for you, it seems like it's more about just making the engine run a lot more efficiently and cleanly for the athlete that way. Yeah, it might have 500 horse in it, but maybe it doesn't need all 500 horse to accomplish the task because of how clean that sucker is running at the end of the day. I think there's something to be said about that, right? Just the constant repetition over and over and over again of similar patterns and similar characteristics that carry over to the sprint. And the more second nature you make those, the more efficient your athlete is going to be at those, the less they have to think about them. And again, the smoother the metaphorical engine is going to run in this case. Obviously, that's something, though, that I never think everything is 100% biomechanical or 100% neurophysiological. I think the two are constantly evolving and kind of clashing with one another that way. Where do you kind of interject on maybe some individual athletes or unique athletes that maybe just mechanically you look at them and you're like, that's what's holding them back right now? They clearly have no idea how to sprint, or their sprint just looks very, very poor. I've seen this with certain Olympic sports in particular. The first one that comes to mind for me is field hockey, where, when you watch them run with their stick on the field, they look incredible. But if you take them off the field, you remove their stick and ask them to do a fly 10, sometimes it can be a very different story. So if you have that case in football where, hey, we're building the reps, we're kind of ingraining that neural side of things. However, mechanically, there's some stuff jumping out that it's just not where we want it to be. How do you approach that from a corrective standpoint, or do you approach it from a corrective standpoint?
That's a really good question. And if I were to sum this up very cleanly, I would say our prep is, and you ask any one of our football players, the days that I run the prep, they kind of moan and groan of that this is going to be a lot. There's a lot that goes into, a good sports performance prep, and any of my interns that's ever been around me will probably tell you the same thing is, this is the common saying is a good performance prep is not distinguishable from the rest of the actual workout or the training session, right? So a lot of our performance prep is going to be obviously the ramp protocol, raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate. But when we get to that mobilize and potentiate section, there's a lot of bandwidth for us to play with, right? And based on the theme of the day, whether it be acceleration or max velocity or even just a tempo session, we're going to be using that to address those kind of mechanical standpoint aspects. Maybe we're just slowing it down and we want to go, 2 hard steps at 70% on each leg. And then I'm going to supplement that when we're coming right back the next 10 yards, you're going to do an ankle dribble and we're going to come back at 80%. And now you're kind of breaking it down into each piece and then slowly bringing it back together to where maybe afterwards we're going to rip a 5-yard or a 10-yard, just essentially race to see that, hey, now we've done the little bit of learning. I'm going to go right into direct application to see if that stuff has stuck. And if not, and next time we come back, we're going to come over as a staff, discuss what worked, what didn't, which is a really fun thing about where I'm at is that every single one of us is not going to agree on everything. Every single one of us is going to have a different ideology and a different kind of perspective on things to where we want to have a thoughtful discussion and, what might look at the surface level as an argument is awesome because now it's got me thinking about different new ways. It's got, Coach DeMarco or Coach Kel, Coach Jake, Coach Evan, Cam, whoever it is thinking about things in a different way that we might be able to address it. And there's no pride in it, which is really what's cool, is that the best product is what's going to win. So if they can get a cue that's going to work a little bit better, we're going to insert that the next time that we're in a prep. We don't have a standardized preparatory period to where it's like, hey, we're going to, go do some arm swings. We're going to go do some skips. We're going to do this, this, and this. It's very much like our movement library stuck in our heads. We have, 10 to 12 to 15 minutes. I want to get essentially, 12 to 15 exercises within there that's going to challenge them, provide some motor learning or motor kind of aspect to get them in some movement literacy. And then I'm going to do an execution standpoint where maybe it is a fast leg, right leg. I'll be honest with you, when that gets tossed into field sport athletes, they tend to struggle a little bit. But the more you do it, you get more repetitions. It starts to look a little bit cleaner. The kinematics clean up when it comes into the sprint because they understand what a front side or a fast recovery, kind of having that snap, feels like. Those are opportunities, instead of just kind of wasting it on a general warm up, to really experiment, break things down. And even if you don't do it right, run it again, right? They're still getting stimulus from there. And it just gives us an opportunity to really kind of ingrain some of those patterns or really work down on a technical aspect. And then the opportunity while we're walking from the turf to our weight room. Our turf is about a 4 or 5 minute walk from our weight room. So you have the people who are really good and in tune and want to get better. Those athletes are coming up to me and asking me different questions. So now it's like brought into, kind of the system of, not only am I wanting them to get better, they want to get better and they want a correction. So now I'm going back to the drawing board and we're testing stuff out after the session on each other to make sure that, we can get it done.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great point. And there could be a whole separate discussion on that character element that comes into speed training as well. Because, like you just mentioned, there is a drastic difference between the athlete that wants to get faster and wants to get better at sprinting and the athlete that doesn't want that as well. And I think the way you broke that down was really well just throughout your methodology methodology and the impacts of the other coaches that you work with as well at Elon that way. One of the things that's really refreshing for me, at least, is nowhere in that did you say we're going to do a highly specific, 5 different bands pulling them different directions, sports specific, Instagram trendy, football specific speed drill or whatever that way. Because so often, in particular around the sport of football, I'll scroll on Instagram and I see different positions, running backs, wideouts, D-backs, whatever, doing these like crazy, like what they're told is sport specific speed development for football, when in reality, they're moving at such low speeds and the low thresholds that I don't know what stimulus they're even getting from it. And I think a lot of the time when we think about sports like football, we try to overcomplicate it. And in reality, it's a lot of just the simple things done ridiculously well, right? Like, I don't know how many times you mentioned skip patterns. It's like how many football athletes can actually do an A skip, B skip, and C skip progression. There's been a number of times where I'm working with athletes and I show them a C skip and like they've never done it before. They have no idea how to do it. It's like a whole process to try and get them just to even learn how to C skip for the first time. So it's like, if they can't even C skip, why am I concerning myself with throwing like all these crazy complex band setups on them and like all these crazy weird cues and drills and stuff? Like, I've seen some just crazy stuff being done in the space that way, so much so that some are literally like throwing bands around the ankles, around the waist, having them do speed ladders and stuff. And it's like, I just think a lot of the times we miss the mark in speed development for football athletes. And if we just keep it ridiculously simple from a fact of you've got to skip, you've got to get these intensive contacts that carry over to the sprint form itself. And then you have to sprint them in a way that makes sense from a progressive framework. It's not like one right way to do it, one wrong way to do it, but there has to be a system in place that you can scale over time and progress over time. And I think if you just hit those big rocks at least 80 to 90% of the time, especially in your lower level competitive side of things, right? Your high school, your D3, NAIA, whatever that way, like you're going to be miles ahead of everyone else, in my opinion.
I think so. And I think a lot of people, it's really easy to overcomplicate sprinting to make it sound like everyone wants to be a genius, right? And I'm in no way, shape, or form far enough removed from it in the enlightenment side that I don't want to be a genius as well. So there's obviously conflicting emotions and thought processes that I have myself, but having good people around you to level you back out is a great thing. Um, but in terms of like when it comes to keeping things very simple, right? Just those simple things, like you said, done savagely well. How hard are you going to coach that? Right? It's easy to put in an A skip or an A march or an A switch, boom booms, triple booms, whatever it is, and say, hey, we got better. But how are you coaching that? Right? For me, one of the main things that I'm always looking at is that ground interaction. How hard are they striking the ground? Right? When we look at like the laws of motion, right? Every action has an equal or opposite reaction. If you're more fixated on the hip flexion, right, which a lot of football players they tend to do, you're always going to hear that little right when they want to yank the knee all the way up, which is great for front side. Don't get me wrong, but how hard are you striking, and how fast is that switch happening, right? If our intention is now flipped from how high can I get the knees to how hard can I strike the ground, that other knee is probably going to get up in the air. We're getting the same product with a different cue and probably being more efficient in the process and creating a better accelerator because now I'm more concerned about the ground contact than I am the lift away from the ground. Right. And I think flipping the script on that is a really good thing. And it's an opportunity to get someone to produce a little bit more force. Right. General strength is great, but contextual strength is probably king in this aspect of, hey, you might be super strong in the weight room, but we don't know how to strike the ground really well. Right. That's why some dudes are absolute freaks and they don't really lift because they do really well contextually within sprinting and they can strike the ground hard, even though they can't front squat 235, whatever it might be. So the goal is how hard can I strike the ground? And when we go through it with that, in terms of like any of those kind of more pushing or piston action kind of drills, every person, whether it be myself, Coach DeMarco, it's always centered around that ground contact and that ground interaction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, movement occurs from the ground up at the end of the day. And as you mentioned, a lot of times we get so caught up in the sprint that we forget about just the simplicity of pushing the ground away. And I feel like I've seen a huge resurgence of that, in particular around football lately, especially with the rise of hip extension once again. It's like everyone is talking about hip extension again, which is amazing to hear. But again, it's just those simple things done savagely well. Like, are you pushing the ground away? What's the ground contact look like? Do you have the hip extension? Can you even extend a hip? Because there's been a lot of individuals that just can't even get into those positions. On top of that, as well, I think if you master these elements from a sprint development and acceleration development standpoint, the rest of your season, you're almost maybe not 100% accurate, but in general, able to predict what's going to happen to what individuals, right? Like you mentioned the pelvic tilt example before. And it's like there's a lot of emerging research coming out about pelvic position and the hamstring issues. Obviously, it's no secret that hamstring soft tissue injuries are a real burden in the sport of football right now. And it's like, hey, look, like if we can get some of these things dialed in and ingrain that what we're calling that neural kind of subconscious position from an early on in the season standpoint, then yeah, the rest of our season's probably going to go a lot better as opposed to if we send them into the season knowing that that's a liability and knowing that like, yes, we need to work on it, but you know, we've tried and we've done our best and we're not going to be able to revisit that. I think the more you pay attention to these small things, the better off you're going to be the rest of your season. And these are things that you really only pick up from a coach's eye standpoint, right? Like there's not going to be one single force plate metric that I've found that carries over to what their sprint is going to look like and how it's going to feel to them. But if you're doing this stuff regularly throughout the season, and obviously ingraining it early on that way, I think it leads you to a like much more likely position of success as a strength coach anyways for the season itself that way. I think this is another area too where a lot of times we get so obsessed with the technological incorporation with things, but you can keep this really simple. Like when you were talking about the GPS work that you do with the guys that way, you know, you're not going off on, you know, 5,000 different metrics that you're looking at. It's simple things. Keep going back to that concept of simple, but it's like, you know, you can be highly effective with developing speed in this population without a $50,000 lab setup. Like you don't need all the bells and whistles. You can still find ways to get it done and get some really good intense training in for the guys.
Man, 100% agree. And this is for anyone who's saying, or thinking to themselves after some of what we talked about is, well, I don't have, GPSs. I don't have this, right? To the least amount of the extent, like you're correct, you're 100% correct is that you don't need this, right? At some point, just like back in the day, you ran races and whoever won the race was going to be the top guy, right? You were just the fastest on the team and that's what you were concerned about. You know, that can be your KPI metric if you're just going to rank those kids and say, hey, you were the fastest today, you won, etc. Right? Or if you just want to have some speed gates. We use Browers, we use the Dasher Silver, which is great now. I time almost everything when it comes to the track and field side when we're actually out of practice, whether it be a 10-meter fly, a 30-meter fly, the speed endurance reps, or even just reps over the hurdles. Um, there's a million different ways to gather data, and there's some far more expensive and some far less expensive. But I think what gets lost in the shuffle is being so I guess, like, encapsulated by the data versus, like, actually losing the art of coaching whatever it is that you're doing and letting the data kind of just be there to support or negate your thoughts so you can use it to kind of modify your training program versus, just chasing a raw number, right?
Ab-
Back in the day, everyone kind of got picked on for like, hey, we're just going to get the best back squat, right? To a certain extent, we're kind of doing that with either, a 10-yard fly or something like that now, where everything is centered around just getting that miles per hour up, right? And in all fairness, miles per hour probably has a higher correlation to success on the field than a back squat does. But at the same time, that that 10-yard fly should be just a little metric to let you know, are you kind of trending in the right path based off of the meat and potatoes that help contribute to that metric versus being the driving force of everything that you do. I think that's where everything gets a little bit fuzzy and a little bit uncomfortable for people to kind of realize is, taking a step back and am I chasing this one metric or am I trying to make a more well-rounded athlete that a skill coach can then take and put the skill around and create a football player or a lacrosse player or whatever it might be.
Absolutely. No, I think that's such a great point. It's chasing that main thing and keeping the main thing at the end of the day and not getting so caught up in the weeds. And as you mentioned about timing gates and some of the other tech that way, and I see that becoming more and more common and more accessible than it ever has before, right? Costs is going down. A lot of the high school people that I talk with, they're getting timing gates now, which is great. But one of the things that I think when it comes to incorporating timing gates, GPS, or any kind of tech into your framework is that you have to have that framework. It's like you can't just set them up and do, 10-yard, fly tens and then, switch to like a 40-yard and then a 30-yard. Like some people are just so scatterbrained and all over the place with their timing gates that I feel like they're just kind of missing the mark on them, for lack of a better way to put it. And they get a lot of numbers and a lot of data, but they have no like ability to answer a question with it because it's just randomly hodgepodged and piecemealed together, as opposed to, in my opinion, I like to start with what question I'm trying to answer first. What is that end goal that I'm trying to get to? From there, that's going to dictate what kind of assessment I select, right? If I need to go top end speed, then I'm not going to get that in a 10-yard, like, standard start. I'm going to need to do something a little bit longer duration or longer distance, I should say. If I want to hone in on that acceleration phase, or maybe I even want to just get more info on how that athlete is sprinting and where they're actually accelerating and where they achieve top end speed. It's like maybe I need multiple sets of timing gates. I'm going to go every 10 yards, 10, 20, 30, 40, and then they're going to do 40s or something like that. But I think unless you have a framework for how you use your timing gates, they're a tool that doesn't necessarily serve a purpose if you're just trying to just throw it at things randomly that way. What's kind of been your own kind of philosophy or approach to applying the timing gates into the work that you do in football?
When it comes to football, it's vastly different for track and field. With the timing gates, we're really only using it for one thing, and that's going to be our 10-yard dash, right? And we do a 1+9, and it's just it takes the variance out of, did they pull their hand away? Now it's just a 1-yard run into a 9-yard kind of dash, but it's 10 yards in total. So that's what we kind of use. And we just have that thrown in, hit one or two at the start at every week to make sure that we're trending in the right direction. But in no way is it a pinnacle piece of the session. It's just in there as if it were another exercise in the entirety of the session, right? It's the same way that we kind of do it in track and field from my practice perspective, where maybe I'm doing a 30-meter or a 10-meter fly as a heat check just to see where we're at. And then we're going to go to the meat potatoes in the sessions where I'm going to get my speed endurance, right? On our acceleration day or et cetera, if we're going to be doing, change of direction work, we're just going to have them, right after the prep. Hey, everyone go hit your 1 rep. We'll mark it down. We'll be able to track that over a period of time. And now we're going to get into our chain sprints. We're going to get into our sleds. We're going to get into some of the races, or maybe we're doing stations and it's going to have, more of a technical aspect. And then we'll have an output aspect and a race, or we're going to bring in some environmental constraints and do true agility work. But it doesn't become the center of the session. And I think that's like the biggest thing that I kind of hone in on, is that it can't be everything. It has to be part of something. And if it's part of something, it's then more productive, because then it's just a guiding thing that helps you along your way versus being the end goal. And if it's the end goal, it's probably not the best end goal you're going to have. And you're going to be pretty disappointed if, hey, my 10-meter fly went all the way up. Why aren't I running better? Well, we probably neglected speed endurance if you're a track athlete. Or my 10-yard dash went all the way up, but I'm not, getting on the field. Well, maybe you don't know the plays. Maybe that your contextual speed in the game that you're releasing and then kind of having to temper in and out of routes and on your cuts isn't as good, because now we focused and fixated on one thing so much that we're missing the forest for the trees.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense, man. I think you outlined that perfectly. And one of the things I've been really impressed with is just how passionate and knowledgeable you are about this space, man. How did you get to this point, and what kind of resources do you recommend for others for their development surrounding like speed training, whether that be on the track and field side, the football side, or the overlap between the two that way?
Yeah. So just like a background on me is, I was a two-sport athlete in college. I played football, and as I was closing out my collegiate career, I hopped over to track based off of the kind of the chirping I got from my strength coach and joining the track team. I ended up working with, he just left the space and isn't coaching anymore at the school, but my sprint coach was absolutely pinnacle in my development as a sprint and speed coach. Um, Teaching me a lot more of the biomechanical aspects versus just the pure output side. And I've been lucky enough to be around some of the smartest people. If anyone knows who Jordan Newsma is, he's a strength coach with the San Francisco 49ers. That was the guy that got me into this, S&C sports performance in the beginning. He was my teammate in college and then my internship coordinator. He's got a book, The 8-Vector System, with Coach DeMarco, who I work with now. Um, Aside from, the people that I've been really lucky to be around, finding new ways and testing things out on your own. I've you almost name any Altus course in the entire book, and I've probably read it, and then taking the ideas and wanting to conflict them in some way, shape, or form is probably more valuable for anyone's development than anything else. But reading any books, I know if you're looking from the weight room side, there's triphasic. If you want to, there's West Side methods for sprinters, all those different things. Charlie Francis is absolutely pinnacle. If you're getting into sprinting, I think that's the first book you should probably read, is Get After Key Concepts by Charlie Francis. It's just outstanding. And then it kind of furthers the development for you to lay the groundwork to be able to experiment and start to find these other new ideas. If you're young in the industry and you're trying to learn, I'd be remiss not to mention the internship we have here at Elon. If you want to learn from me, if you want to learn from Coach DeMarco, the great coaches that we have around, we're always looking for young, hungry interns. We want to get you hired. We want to get you in space. But the information you're going to get and the opportunity to coach and be more refined going into the industry is second to none. And maybe I'm biased to it because I'm the internship coordinator here, but I'll tell you what, we haven't had someone who's gone out into the space and gotten a job that said that we weren't a good piece or a good chunk of their learning and development for that. Um, the other aspect too is test on yourself. Everyone is so scared, anytime we see a young coach, they're really into the weight room. They always want to have a big lift. And don't get me wrong, I'm part of it. I love a heavy RDL, a heavy front squat, whatever it is. But get out there and run. Find out what works for you. If you can figure out something that might work for you, it might work for somebody else. That can help you cue and start to develop these own new thought processes as you kind of go and grow.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great point, and it's one of those things that I echo a lot as well. It's just being willing to walk the walk at the end of the day. Like, if you're willing to dish it out to your athletes, at least give it a shot at some point on your own, just so you know what stimulus you're applying to the athletes that way. See how you feel after, you done your little speed agility session, whatever it is, and then go into lift for an hour that way, right? It's like, that gives you a good insight as to how the athletes are doing. There's even some strength coaches I've seen lately that are doing everything that their athletes do kind of on their own time separate that way, right? They're doing the same lift programming, they're doing the same conditioning programming. And I think that ability to know kind of how your athletes feel, because you might feel similar yourself, is just unrivaled in this space. I think that's phenomenal insight and advice. Now, obviously, as you mentioned, Brian, you guys have a phenomenal internship and a phenomenal facility down there in Elon, North Carolina. Amazing space, by the way, too, for people who haven't been. It's probably one of the best campuses I've ever been on. Had the pleasure of checking that out with homeboy Jake back in April that way. For people who want to find out more about you and obviously Elon and so on that way, where can they find you all at?
Yeah. You can find us at Elon Performance. That's our Instagram tag. The same thing as the Twitter handle. Me personally, I'm not extremely active on Twitter. I'm more of a casual viewer, if you will. But B Szutkowski, just Bszutkowski. If you find Elon, you'll probably see a lot of me tagged in that stuff. That's my Instagram handle. I have my own podcast as well that I rock with Christian French, who is down in the Dominican Republic with the Chicago Cubs Dominican Development Academy. Talk about energy drinks, but a lot of it is centered around sports performance talks, and that's just Bev Boys, and that's on YouTube and Spotify as well.
That's awesome. We'll link to all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there. Brian, this has been awesome, man. Anything we missed in our discussion? I mean, I feel like we could probably go on all day and still just, barely scratch the surface at this. But anything else you want to bring up? Or
Think I'm good. These are
awesome.
people wanting more.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Really appreciate your time and insights and all the work that you and the crew down there at Elon is doing that way. And looking forward to future conversations with you, man.
Of course. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.